let's break down the entire fate of the droid army following the conclusion of the Clone Wars. During the war, the battle droids, which comprised the army of the CIS, were one of the most domineering militaristic forces in the galaxy. One of the greatest it's ever seen, in fact. While each individual droid may not have been much in the face of a Jedi or a squad of competent troopers, they were incredibly dangerous in large number. Dooku once estimated that the Grand Army of the Republic was outnumbered 100 to 1 in the face of the droid army. When developed in overwhelming numbers, Sidious attested to their usefulness. And because of this, millions upon millions of them were manufactured for the war. But that leaves us a question. What happened to all of these millions of battle droids after Order 66? Once Sidious called the Dreadful Order, the droids, which were once such a problem, seemed to fade out completely in the background overnight. But of course, that many units existing at one time couldn't have all just vanished, so what happened to them when the Clone War was over? Well, my friends, today's video has that answer. First, Palpatine commanded that all the droid facilities were to be shut down after Anakin Skywalker betrayed the Jedi Order and Order 66 was enacted. The deactivation code he dispatched to all the units in the galaxy at a single time. However, it was much different than the Phantom Menace when the control ship was destroyed. After that incident, the battle droids were no longer operational from a central control unit. They each had their own internal power supply and a brain of sorts, however simple it was, so the deactivation codes were usually given to the one in charge of each droid garrison, whether that be a sentient being or a tactical droid. It was up to them to obey the orders and decommission the droid units. In the wake of the Jedi being hunted and murdered like dogs, the Republic being reorganized into the Empire, and the Separatist worlds forced at gunpoint to stand down, it's easy to see how the state of the battle droids became a bit more of an afterthought to Sidious. He put in a few parameters, however, to ensure that they wouldn't become a problem for the future. Firstly, any and all use of battle droids for militaristic purposes was outlawed by the Empire. This was to ensure no one decided to become the second wave of the CIS, and therefore basically rehash the Clone War. This was enforced with an iron fist, but was mostly geared towards independent systems and manufacturers. There would be no distribution of military forces under the Empire, though a few companies would exploit some loopholes in this. HoloWin Laboratories, for instance, the maker of the IG series, would rebrand their products as simply security droids, as the Empire had no law against security droids. But by and large, for battle droids that didn't receive deactivation codes, there were standing orders for all stormtroopers to execute on sight. But it wasn't as though they were jumping at the opportunity to own or use these units. At the time, they had become something as a relic in the face of the superior technology of the Empire. But not only that, public opinion on the very concept of a battle droid dropped dramatically after the Clone War. As seen by the flashbacks of Din Djarin, the average citizen had severe trauma related to the fourth class droid. This is, droids specifically for military functions. There were so many that had such a stigma against the machines that they despised all droids in totality. This was why R2 and 3PO were not allowed in the Mos Eisley Cantina and had to wait outside. Very quickly after the war, the B1s, B2s, Droidekas, Commando droids, and all the other series popularly used would be rounded up and destroyed in large factories on the worlds like Corellia. But as we mentioned, it was up to those in charge of the droids to give them the deactivation code, so of course several slipped through the cracks. None is better than an example than that of the General Kalani, who we meet in Star Wars Rebels Season 3 Episode 6. Kalani was a super tactical droid who had an abnormal amount of independence. In fact, he was one of the only droids that refused to answer the identification number, and instead chose his own name. Around the time of the Clone Wars' end, Kalani had been ordered by Dooku directly to retreat to the planet of Agamar. There, he would await further deployment. In the orbit of Agamar, Kalani and his forces came under attack by the Republic, causing them to crash on the surface. When the time came that Kalani was given the order to deactivate the army and himself, he refused it, calculating it to be a Republic trick. He would remain on Agamar for 17 years until he was encountered by the Ghost crew and Captain Rex. He had accepted that the Clone Wars had ended for the wider galaxy, but decided to force the rebels to fight in a battle simulation so that he could force an ending to the Clone Wars the way that it was intended, with a separatist victory. But that was when the Empire arrived to destroy the crew. It was here that the rebels and Kalani joined forces against the Empire, much to the chagrin of Rex. After a miraculous victory, Kalani was finally able to escape the world, but not before he and Rex agreed that the Clone Wars was finally over. The super tactical droid did not join the rebellion, however, as he believed that they had less than a 1% chance of defeating the Empire, and with that, the rebels parted ways. Unfortunately though, the fate of Kalani and his droids is currently unknown in canon, though a story with them in the future would be awesome. Aside from that incident though, it was extremely rare that any battle droid remained together as a cohesive military after the war. Leftover droids were reprogrammed by those that would find them, leading to some people having entire private armies of B-1 battle droids. These were usually scrappers trying to protect their turf, or even pockets of insurgents attempting to use a small reactivated army as a bulwark against the new oppressive empire. This was the case of the engineer by the name of Gazor Delso, who restarted the factory of Mustafar. In response, the 501st Legion, now the Stormtrooper Corps, were sent to take out the droids, to take out Gazor permanently. Oftentimes, these private armies were shredded apart like scraps by the stormtroopers, and for about another decade following the end of the war, the Stormtrooper Corps was made up of clone veterans of the war, so battle droids were nothing to them. Soon, all remaining cells of Confederate loyalists began to keep some battle droids just for security purposes in their secret outposts. Other decommissioned units were kept in massive warehouses by tech dealers, those who sold them to crime lords as cheap and plentiful private muscles. The last real time that we'd see their use as a real army was when they were reawakened by the Dark Jedi Dagan Gera, who would use them to buff out the ranks of the Bedlam Raiders. Cal Kestis would have to deal with them whenever he went up against Dagan, which I suppose means that he got to have his own taste of what he missed out on in the Clone War. After the Jedi's death though, his last subordinates in the Bedlam Raiders attempted to rally their forces against Cal to avenge their leader. However, Kestis dealt with them easily, and the Bedlam Raiders, along with their droid army, were never seen again. But there would be yet another war between the droids and the Empire during the Galactic Civil War, in fact. At the time, the Emperor had taken great care to ensure that it was impossible to feasibly create one clone army or a droid army, but there was one instance where the droids would actually save the day. Captain Wedge Antilles once crashed on Geonosis while being chased by a contingent of troopers. While there, he found a wealth of battle droids, those that he ended up reactivating to protect himself. He lured his pursuers into a trap where the B-1s rose from the dead, laying waste to the Imperial forces. Since these troopers were not clone veterans, they fell very quickly to the droids' overwhelming firepower. An interesting insight into the droids versus the stormtroopers. But this does bring up a question. Why didn't the rebels just use the battle droids to fight the Empire? We also plan on making a full video out of that, and breaking down exactly why the droids were not a viable option for the Rebel Alliance. But by the end of the Galactic Civil War, battle droids as a concept had all but faded from relevancy. The last of their kind was a little lovely unit by the name of Mr. Bones. This was a reprogrammed and a heavily modified B-1 series droid, one constructed by a teenage rebel Temmin Wexley, using spare parts and pieces found from a separatist factory. Since Temmin had no friends, he constructed his own friend and named him Mr. Bones. The droid ended up becoming Wexley's bodyguard and his most loyal companion. He had been repurposed for various combat droid programs, martial arts videos, and the movement style of one General Grievous. Mr. Bones was nearly undefeatable in single combat, in fact, wielding a variety of weaponry, the most notable of which was a long vibroblade embedded into his right hand. Besides his skill, he had a murderous and a sadistic personality to the point where he enjoyed singing when executing his victims. He was painted red and black to set him apart. Half of his face was replaced with a telescoping eye, and his nose was sharpened to the point to resemble a bird of prey. But one modification that Bones added himself was the actual bones of birds or animals to his armor. Despite his sadistic nature, he deeply cared for Temmin and his family, considering himself a part of it. Mr. Bones has a long and a very interesting story that we won't go into full detail here, but he would go on to aid the rebellion in several instances. Eventually, he offered his services to the New Republic and would meet his end during the Battle of Jakku. But that, my friends, was the revenge of the battle droids against the Empire. we oftentimes note the clone troopers as victims, but also the droids were as well, having brains themselves, although of course inferior. The droids were largely scattered in various places across the galaxy. Of course, we see them again in Plazir 15 in The Mandalorian, where a former separatist would repurpose them to use in civilian tasks. But this video was of course about war. But just like the Clone Wars, the droids themselves would be long forgotten. As always, my friends, thank you so much for supporting the archives. Let me know if you want that video about the Rebel Alliance and the battle droids, and have an absolutely phenomenal day.